Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening from wherever you're watching or listening. My name is Caleb Glick. I'm a lawyer here in the great state of Texas with the Calhoun School of Law to bring you a lot of information that plenty of bad folks would rather you not have. Today, ladies and gentlemen, we'll provide another installation to our series on Mr. Algernon Sidney's work titled Discourses Concerning Government. Understanding his work is going to greatly benefit you in going about trying to understand what the founding generation did in the U.S. Declaration of Independence, U.S. Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, so on and so forth, because Algernon Sidney's works, not just Discourses Concerning Government, greatly influenced the founding generation's thinking. So let's go ahead and jump on over to the Discourses Concerning Government. We are going on to section 14. So if you haven't gone back and watched the preceding sections, I highly encourage you to do so because, like I was saying, his work greatly influenced the founders. So if you want to know what they were thinking, who founded their principles, this gentleman and his work is going to be greatly to your benefit. Now, this is going to be a longer section, but this one, when I was reading through, makes quite a few good arguments. So have your highlighters ready and buckle in for the longer haul, at least in terms for this lecture. So section 14, he titles with, If the paternal right had included dominion and was to be transferred to a single heir, it must perish if he were not known, and could be applied to no other person. Pay very close attention to what he's saying here. So he starts off, having showed that the first kings were not fathers, nor the first fathers kings, that all the kings of the Jews and Gentiles mentioned in Scripture came in upon titles different from and inconsistent with that of paternity, and that we are not led by the word, nor the works of God, nor the reason of man or light of nature to believe there is any such thing, we may safely conclude there never was any such thing, or that it never had any effect, which to us is the same. 'Tis as ridiculous to think of retrieving that which from the beginning of the world was lost, as to create that which never was. But I may go farther and affirm that though there had been such a right in the first fathers of mankind exercised by them, and for some ages individually transmitted to their eldest sons, it must necessarily perish, since the generations of men are so confused that no man knows his own original, and consequently this heir is nowhere to be found. For 'tis a folly for a man to pretend to an inheritance who cannot prove himself to be the right heir. If this be not true, I desire to know from which of Noah's sons the kings of England, France, or Spain do deduce their original, or what reason they can give why the title to dominion, which is fancied to be in Noah, did rather belong to the first of their respective races that attained to the crowns they now enjoy, than to the meanest peasant of their kingdoms. Or how that can be transmitted to them which was not in the first. We know that no man can give what he hath not, that if there be no giver, there is no gift. If there be no root, there can be no branch. And that the first point failing, all that should be derived from it must necessarily fail. What does that sound identical to? You judge a tree by its fruits. Now, there is a slight difference in terms of the comparison that metaphor is making, but how are you going to judge the fruit of a tree if the tree was never rooted? That's what Algernon Sidney is explaining here. How are all of these different kings going to claim they have paternal right to rule when they can't even define what paternity they derive that right to rule from? He goes on. Our author, who is good at resolving difficulties, shows us an easy way out of this strait. Quote, "'Tis true,' says he, 'all kings are not natural parents of their subjects, yet they either are or are to be reputed the next heirs to those first progenitors, who were at first the natural parents of the whole people, and in their right succeed to the exercise of the supreme jurisdiction, and such heirs are not only lords of their own children, but also of their brethren, and all those that were subject to their father, etc. But this means it comes to pass that many a child succeeding a king hath the right of a father over many a grey-headed multitude, and hath the title of pater patriae. In assertion comprehending so many points, upon which the most important rights of all mankind do depend, might deserve some proof. But he being of opinion we ought to take it upon his credit, doth not vouchsafe to give us so much as the shadow of any. Nevertheless, being unwilling either crudely to receive or rashly to reject it, I shall take the liberty of examining the proposition, and hope I may be pardoned if I dwell a little more than ordinarily upon that which is the foundation of his work. We are beholden to him for confessing modestly that all kings are not the natural fathers of their people, and sparing us the pains of proving that the kings of Persia, who reigned from the Indies to the Hellespont, did not beget all the men that lived in those countries, or that the kings of France and Spain, who began to reign before they were 5 years old, were not the natural fathers of nations under them. But if all kings are not fathers, none are, as they are kings. If anyone is, or ever was, the rights of paternity belong to him, and to no other who is not so also. This must be made evident, for matters of such importance require proof, and ought not to be taken upon supposition. If Filmer, so he's addressing Robert Filmer's work, Patriarcha, if Filmer therefore will pretend that the right of father belongs to any one king, he must prove that he is the father of his people, for otherwise it doth not appertain to him. He is not the man we seek. 'Tis no less absurd to say he is to be reputed heir to the first progenitor, for it must be first proved that the nation did descend from one single progenitor without mixture of other races, that this progenitor was the man to whom Noah, according to Filmer's whimsical division of Asia, Europe, and Africa among his sons, did give the land now inhabited by that people, that this division so made was not capable of subdivisions, and that this man is by a true and uninterrupted succession descended from the first and eldest line of that progenitor. And all fails if every one of these points be not made good. If there never was any such man who had that right, it cannot be inherited from him. If by the same rule that a parcel of the world was allotted to him, that parcel might be subdivided amongst his children as they increased, the subdivisions may be infinite, and the right of dominion thereby destroyed. If several nations inhabit the same land, they owe obedience to several fathers. That which is due to their true father cannot be rendered to him that is not so, for he would by that means be deprived of the right which is inseparably annexed to his person. And lastly, whatsoever the right of an heir may be, it can belong only to him that is heir. Lest any should be seduced from these plain truths by frivolous suggestions, 'tis good to consider that the title of Pater Patriae, with which our author would cheat us, hath no relation to the matters of right, upon which we dispute. 'Tis a figurative speech, that may have been rightly enough applied to some excellent princes on account of their care and love to their people, resembling that of a father to his children, and can relate to none but those who had it. No man that had common sense or valued truth did ever call Phalaris, Dionysus, Nabis, Nero, or Caligula fathers of their countries, but monsters that to the utmost of their power endeavored their destruction. Which is enough to prove that sacred name cannot be given to all, and in consequence to none but such as by their virtue, piety, and good government do deserve it. These matters will yet appear more evident if it be considered that though Noah had reigned as a king, that Zoroaster, as some suppose, was Ham, who reigned over his children, and that thereby some right might perhaps be derived to such as succeeded them. Yet this can have no influence upon such as have not the like original, and no man is to be presumed to have it, till it be proved, since we have proved that many had it not. If Nimrod set himself up against his grandfather, and Ninus, who is descended from him in the 5th generation, slew him, not flew. Sometimes that F and S similar shape that they were writing in back then still tricks me up. Slew him, not flew him. Slew him. They ill deserve the name and rights of fathers. and none but those who have renounced all humanity, virtue, and common sense can give it to them, or their successors. If therefore Noah and Shem had not so much as the shadow of regal power in the actions of Nimrod, Ninus, and others who were kings in their times, show they did not reign in the right of fathers, but were set up in a direct opposition to it. The titles of the first kings were not from paternity, nor consistent with it. Our author, therefore, who should have proved every point, doth neither prove anyone, nor assert that which is agreeable to divine or human story, as to matter of fact, and as little conformable to common sense. It does not only appear contrary to his general proposition that all governments have not begun with the paternal power, but we do not find that any ever did. They who, according to his rules, should have been lords of the whole earth, lived and died private men, whilst the wildest and most boisterous of their children commanded the greatest part of the then inhabited world, not excepting even those countries where they spent and ended their days. And instead of entering upon the government by the right of fathers, or managing it as fathers, they did by the most outrageous injustice usurp a violent domination over their brethren and fathers. It may easily be imagined what the right is that could be thus acquired and transmitted to their successors. Nevertheless, our author says, quote, all kings either are or ought to be reputed next heirs, etc. But why reputed if they were not? How could any of the accursed race of Ham be reputed father of Noah or Shem, to whom he was to be a servant? How could Nimrod and Ninus be reputed fathers of Ham and of those whom they ought to have obeyed? Can reason oblige me to believe that which I know to be false? Can a lie that is hateful to God and good men not only be excused, but enjoined when, as he will perhaps say, it is for the king's service? Can I serve two masters, or without the most unpardonable injustice repute him to be my father who is not my father, and pay the obedience that's due to him who did beget and educate me, to one from whom I never received any good? If this be so absurd that no man dares affirm it in the person of any, 'tis as preposterous in relation to his heirs. For Nimrod, the first king, could be heir to no man as king, and could transmit to no man a right which he had not. If it was ridiculous and abominable to say that he was father of Cush, Ham, Shem, and Noah, 'tis as ridiculous to say he had the right of father, if he was not their father, or that his successors inherited it from him, if he never had it. If there be any way through this, it must have accrued to him by the extirpation of all his elders and their races. So as he will assert this pretended right to have been in the Babylonian kings, must assert that Noah, Shem, Japheth, Ham, Cush, and all Nimrod's elder brothers, with all their descendants, were utterly extirpated before he began to reign, and all mankind to be descended from him. This must be, if Nimrod, as the scripture says, was the first that became mighty in the earth, unless men might be kings without having more power than others. For Cush, Ham, and Noah were his elders and progenitors in the direct line, and all the sons of Shem and Japheth and their descendants in the collaterals were to be preferred before him. And he could have no right at all that was not directly contrary to those principles which our author says are grounded upon the eternal and indispensable laws of God and nature. The like may be said of the 72 heads of colonies, which, following, as I suppose, Sir Walter Raleigh, he says, went out to people the earth, and whom he calls kings. For, according to the same rule, Noah, Shem, and Japheth, with their descendants, could not be of the number, so that neither Nimrod nor the others that established the kingdoms of the world, and from whence he thinks all the rest to be derived, could have anything of justice in them, unless it were from a root altogether inconsistent with his principles. They are therefore false, or the establishments before mentioned could have no right. If they had none, they cannot be reputed to have any. For no man can think that to be true which he knows to be false. Having none, they could transmit none to their heirs and successors. And if we are to believe that all the kingdoms of the earth are established upon this paternal right, it must be proved that all those who in birth ought to have been preferred before Nimrod and the 72 were extirpated, or that the first and true heir of Noah did afterwards abolish all these unjust usurpations, and making himself master of the whole, left it to his heirs, in whom it continues to this day. When this is done, I will acknowledge the foundation to be well laid, and admit of all that can be rightly built upon it. But if this fails, all fails. The poison of the root continues in the branches. If the right heir be not in possession, he is not the right who is in possession. If the true heir be known, he ought to be restored to his right. If he be not known, the right must perish. That cannot be said to belong to any man, if no man knows to whom it belongs, and can have no more effect than if it were not. So really, in short, like he said in the summary at the top of the page, which is why, so far, every summary that he provides at the very top, at the top of the section, aptly summarizes what he argues. What he's saying, in short, is that, okay, let's just say for argument's sake, even though the Bible contradicts it, let's say, just for argument's sake, that paternal right to rule exists. We then have to determine who was the original paternal ruler. And then we need to follow and discover the total genealogy of that person and his heirs. And if we can't do that, then we're going to appoint someone who doesn't honestly possess a paternal right to rule. Which means we can either disobey this supposed law that Robert Filmer is alluding to, paternal right to rule, by appointing someone who is not the heir to that paternal right, or we abolish the paternal right, this supposed paternal right, and establish a true government. Either way, this argument that Filmer is trying to put forth is baseless, is meritless, because it's almost a guarantee that you're not going to be able to trace back the lineage of all of these different kings that supposedly supports this paternal right to rule. And when you do, it's likely going to be the case that the people in charge have zero claim to that right. So what do? You do what Mr. Sidney says. You realize, actually, God, the Bible, these laws that even Filmer is alluding to, don't support this argument. And that the government of the individuals is precisely that. The individuals governing themselves, their own determination, their own wills, which of course have to be in accordance with God's will in order to be a legitimate, honest government. But that's the argument he's making here. Back to Mr. Sidney. This conclusion will continue unmovable, though the division into 72 kingdoms were allowed, which cannot be without destroying the paternal power or subjecting it to be subdivided into as many parcels as there are men. If it were true, why were these 72 different kingdoms laid out? As there are men, which destroys regality. For the same thing may be required in every one of the distinct kingdoms and others derived from them. We must know who was that true heir of Noah that recovered all, how, when, and to whom he gave the several portions, and that every one of them do continue in the possession of those who by this prerogative of birth are reified above the rest of mankind. And if they are not, 'tis an impious folly to repute them so, the prejudice of those that are. And if they do not appear, the prejudice of all mankind, who being equal are thereby made subject to them. For as truth is the rule of justice, there can be none when he is reputed superior to all who is certainly inferior to. Goes on further. Degenerated from that reason which distinguisheth men from beasts, though it may be fit to use some ceremonies before a man be admitted to practice physic, or set up a trade, 'tis his own skill that makes him a doctor or an artificer, and others do but declare it. An ass will not leave his stupidity, though he be covered with scarlet, and he that is by nature a slave will be so still, though a crown be put upon his head. And 'tis hard to imagine a more violent inversion of the laws of God in nature than to reify him to the throne whom nature intended for the chain, or to make them slaves to slaves, whom God hath endued with the virtues required in kings. Nothing can be more preposterous than to impute to God the frantic domination which is often exercised by wicked, foolish, and vile persons over the wise, valiant, just, and good, or to subject the best to the rage of the worse. If there be any family, therefore, in the world that can by the law of God and nature, distinct from the ordinance of man, pretend to an hereditary right of dominion over any people, it must be one that never did and never can produce any person that is not free from all the infirmities and vices that render him unable to exercise the sovereign power, and is endued with all the virtues required to that end, or at least a promise from God, verified by experience, that the next in blood shall ever be able and fit for that work. But since we do not know that any such hath yet appeared in the world, we have no reason to believe that there is, or ever was, any such. And excuse me. And consequently, none upon whom God hath conferred the rights that cannot be exercised without them. If there was no shadow of a paternal right in the institution of the kingdoms of Saul and David, there could be none in those that succeeded. Rehoboam could have no other than from Solomon. When he reigned over 2 tribes, and Jeroboam over 10, 'tis not possible that both of them could be the next heir of their last common father, Jacob. And 'tis absurd to say that ought to be reputed, which is impossible. For our thoughts are ever to be guided by truth, or such an appearance of it as doth persuade or convince us. The same title of father is yet more ridiculously or odiously applied to the succeeding kings. Baasha had no other title to the crown than by killing Nadab, the son of Jeroboam, and destroying his family. Zimri purchased the same honor by the slaughter of Elah when he was drunk, and dealing with the house of Baasha as he had done with that of Jeroboam. Zimri, burning himself, transferred the same to Omri as a reward for bringing him to that extremity. As Jehu was more fierce than these, he seems to have gained a more excellent recompense than any since Jeroboam, even a conditional promise of a perpetual kingdom. But falling from these glorious privileges purchased by his zeal in killing 2 wicked kings and above 100 of their brethren, Shallum inherited them by destroying Zachary and all that remained of his race. This, in plain English, is no less than to say that whosoever kills a king and invades a crown, though the act and means of accomplishing it be never so detestable, does thereby become father of his country and heir of all the divine privileges annexed to that glorious inheritance. And though I cannot tell whether such a doctrine be more sottish, not too sure what that word's supposed to be. I'm not familiar with the word sottish. Monstrous or impious, those I'm familiar with, I dare affirm that if it were received, no king in the world could think himself safe in his throne for one day. They are already encompassed with many dangers, but left pride, avarice, ambition, lust, rage, and all the vices that usually reign in the hearts of worldly men should not be sufficient to invite them perpetually to disturb mankind through the desire of gaining the power, riches, and splendor that accompanies a crown. Our author proposes to them the most sacred privileges as a reward of the most execrable crimes. He that was stirred up only by the violence of his nature thought that a kingdom could never be bought at too dear a rate. But if the sacred character of God's anointed or vicegerent and father of a country were added to the other advantages that follow the highest fortunes, the most modest and just men would be filled with fury that they might attain to them. Nay, it may be, even the best would be the most forward in conspiring against such as reigned. Not sure why I thought resigned. As reigned. They who could not be tempted with external pleasures would be most in love with divine privileges, and since they should become the sacred ministers of God if they succeeded, and traitors or rogues only if they miscarried, their only care would be so to lay their designs that they might be surely executed. This is a doctrine worthy of Fillmore's invention, and Heylyn's approbation, which being well weighed, will show to all good and just kings how far they are obliged to those who, under pretense of advancing their authority, fill the minds of men with such notions as are so desperately pernicious to them. Excellent. So that is all to be said in section number 14. If you have any questions about what was said in number 14, questions about what was said in the preceding sections, or maybe there's a topic you'd like me to cover in a future lecture, go ahead and post those down in the comments, because the entire purpose of the Calhoun School of Law is to equip you with the necessary skills and information, such as this, to combat any sort of lawfare that will be waged against you, your loved ones, or your hard-earned property. So please, if you have any questions, go ahead and post them down in the comments. Excellent. So my name is Caleb Glick. I'm a lawyer here in the great state of Texas with the Calhoun School of Law to bring you a lot of information that plenty of bad folks would rather not have. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and if not, while you're down in the comments, go ahead and let me know how I can do better so I can best serve that purpose of helping you. I hope y'all have a wonderful day, and until I see y'all in the next lecture for the next topic, I bid you all farewell.